New to the Go Lab, just a reminder as to who we are. We're a research center based at the University of Oxford. We were set up back in 2016 as a partnership between the university and the UK government. And over the past 6 years, we've been investigating how governments can work effectively with those in the voluntary sector as well as the private sector on outcome-focused partnerships. And obviously, as part of that, looking at impact bonds has been key. We're quite unusual as a research organization in that we're very practice focused. So alongside our research work, we also very proactively seek to engage with policymakers and practitioners, both in the UK and internationally. And we're very, very passionate about making sure that the research that we generate and the insights that we generate through our research, and indeed the interesting findings generated by other researchers, evaluators, and other practitioners in the field are actively used by practitioners and policymakers in their decision-making programs, in the way they design impact bonds and other types of outcomes-based partnerships. And it's this ethos of creating an open platform for researchers, scholars, practitioners, policymakers to come together. It's in this ethos that we've launched 2 years ago, the Engaging with Evidence series, which really aims to create an open platform for all the different experts from different sectors to come together, share learning, exchange insights, very much grounded in the latest research and evidence coming out of the field. So I think back in 2016, when we started on our journey, in one of our first reports, we said that there's not enough evidence, there's not enough data in the field to answer some of the key questions that we know practitioners are asking. We've made a tremendous amount of progress since. So it's really great. We've been really busy with Engaging with Evidence series. We've been featuring lots of interesting evaluators, researchers, practitioners, covering a whole range of both impact bonds, outcome funds, but a suite of other topics as well. And you'll see on the slide here, we've got a session coming up in December where we're going to be looking specifically at the final results of the Quality Education India development impact bond. So if that's something that you're interested in, do click on that Zoom or scan the QR code and sign up for that session. But for today, we've got an absolutely fantastic lineup of speakers, and huge thanks to each one of you for joining us. So between our 5 panelists today, we've literally got decades, I counted, and I think it's over 6 decades of experience, either designing impact bonds, advising on impact bonds, evaluating impact bonds, managing programs, delivering impact bonds. So really a wealth of experience, primarily in the UK, but beyond as well. And as I was saying at the start, the focus of the discussion today is the insights coming out of the evaluation of the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund. However, we think there's a lot of juicy insights from the report that actually are very important and very interesting beyond the UK. We've got a packed agenda. We've got about 90 minutes together. We're going to spend the first part of the session hearing from James and Neil, 2 of the authors of the evaluation report. So they'll give us a flavor of the most interesting things coming out of the report, but do read the whole report. It's absolutely amazing. And then part 2 will be a panel discussion where, alongside James, Neil, and Phil from the National Lottery Community Fund, we'll also be joined by Chris Drinkwater, who chaired Waste to Wellness for a few good years, and we'll also be joined by our own research director, El Carter. So without further ado, I'll get us started. But before that, I see we've got 49 participants on the sessions, which is amazing. As you'll know, if you've joined one of these sessions before, we like to keep them really interactive, really engaging. And everyone as a participant plays a key role in that. So it would be really great if each one of you could just take 1 minute to just introduce yourselves in the chat, just your name, maybe where you're joining us from, your organization. And really key thing, I really want to know what brought you to the session. Is there a particular question that you have, maybe for one of the authors of the reports, or do you want to share some of your own insights and how they relate to what we're going to be discussing today? Whether it's a question or something you want to share, do drop it in the chat. And it's also really lovely to be able to see your faces. So if you want and can keep your camera on, please do so. Right, so with that, we are ready to get started. So Phil, can I come to you first just for an overview of the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, especially for those on Zoom who are maybe less familiar with the fund? I think a lot of people in the UK will know it pretty well. But over to you, Phil.
Okay, this is going to be a very, very quick overview of CBO, Commissioning Better Outcomes, which is aiming at funding SIBs and other outcome-based commissioners contracts. We launched our program in 2013, a £40 million program, lottery funded, following on from a government initiative, Social Outcomes Fund, and linked with similar aims and objectives. We have limitations. Our funding is only in England, and it's only for health, education, environment, and charitable sectors. We don't cover the areas the other lottery charities work in. It's a test and learn program. We're interested in finding what works and what doesn't, and the evaluation is absolutely central to that. And our overarching aim is to grow the market in SIBs. There were 13 when we started. There's about 90 or so now, so we've helped in that. We've got 4 program objectives: commissioner engagement and upskilling, which has been mixed so far; early intervention supporting those least able to access service provision, which has been pretty good; new investment to fund primarily VCSE delivery, and that has been really excellent; and impactful learning with the evaluation as our centerpiece. With respect to the evaluation, the update report is part of many products which are being produced by James, Neil and colleagues in conjunction with ourselves. It is an interim situation based on the in-depth reviews and building a strategic picture of the in-depth reviews at midpoint. So the data is drawn from 2018 and we're now obviously 4 years later. So later in the presentation, I'll pick up on some of the latest updates on CBO for your information. We're looking forward to taking the findings from the update report into future products, which are going to be rolling off our production line from January next year, 9 in-depth reviews, and which will be published by the end of 23-24, followed by a final summative report, which will be issued around March 25. And next slide, please. We have, oh, sorry, go back to the previous one. We funded 24 awards. 271,000 people have been engaged in the services delivered, primarily in a project run by Elton John AIDS Foundation, but about 30 or 40,000 from being in other projects. 190 VCSEs engaged with 92 paid, which is much, much larger than we expected. 54 commissioners have paid outcomes and 62 have been engaged in the programme. And we've had 9 investors, the main 3 bridges, Care and Wellbeing and Big Issue Invest. Policy areas, as referenced, we covered the main areas of health with 9 projects, social care 8 projects, employment 5 projects, and youth engagement 2 projects. The geography, half of the projects are London based. We had a reasonably large contingent in the north and in the southwest and the Midlands, and a couple in the southeast. Next slide, please. We were looking for the input from CBO to serve a number of purposes. We wanted to help VCSEs engage with PBR contracts. We wanted to see VCSEs primarily as providers, but we were delighted to find that VCSEs came in as managers of SIBs, as specialist supporters, as people helping other VCSEs engage. We wanted to build cross-sector relationships, and we've seen several of those with multiple commissioner models, with NHS commissioners working with local authorities, and with private sector coming in some areas working with VCSEs. We wanted to reduce financial dependency on the fund. A lot of grants, people with grants keep coming back to us. One of the benefits from our our perspective is that we fund about 24% of the cost of the SIB, which means that for every pound we put in, £3 come in from other sources, and therefore the programme leverages much more financial support than we could do on our own, and it becomes a model for other social investment taking place within the fund. We wanted to create learning, not just within the social investment sector, but also to take that learning and apply it to non-social investment areas where we might be able to use social investment to leverage further resource. We wanted to strengthen VCSE resilience through their understanding of data, through their performance management, through their engagement with and learning from investors, and drawing that information into their own arrangement to increase their sustainability in drawing forward the projects to a later stage. We want to see innovation, and many of the interventions which have been trialled have been the first time they've been done at scale within England and within the world in some cases. We wanted to generate income to all stakeholders where successful. So the commissioners would generate savings, the investor would get their dividend, the providers would get income and would get some surplus from that, and the SIB would break even. And in over half of the cases that we funded, that has been the case. And that's me for now. Any questions?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil, for that excellent summary of the funds. And it's really helpful grounding before we move on to a deeper discussion of the insights that James Neil have generated through their midpoint evaluation report. So I suggest we move on to James and Neil, and I'll ask each one of them to first introduce themselves, and we'll then pause for questions both about the fund specifically and the findings from the evaluation. So, but do keep popping your questions in the chats as we go along. And as I said, once we've heard from James and Neil, we'll stop for questions. So James, Neil, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I'm going to go first, and then halfway through the presentation, I'll hand over to Neil, and maybe I'll let Neil introduce himself at that point in the presentation. I'm James Ronicle. I'm a director at Ecoris. We're a research and evaluation organization. Of those 6 decades Andrea referred to, I think one of them I can claim. I don't know who's got the other 5, but I'll be interested to hear what everyone says. We've been evaluating impact bonds for close on 10 years now, with the Commissioning Better Outcomes evaluation, but also looking at other impact bonds in the UK and overseas as well, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I'm the lead on the evaluation. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the presentation Neil and I are going to be talking through today is, as Andrea mentioned, in relation to our 3rd update report on the CBO evaluation. This was published earlier on this year, and as Phil said, it's an interim report giving a sort of halfway through picture of the progress on CBO, if you like. It's a long-term outcomes fund, and we're following and tracking the evaluation throughout. So we'll be providing findings on what we've seen so far in our evaluation. Next slide, please. Thank you. We'll be covering 3 parts. So I'll be just giving a very brief introduction to the evaluation. Then I'll be focusing on our mapping of the SIBs within CBO and how their designs differ and the reasons why. Then I'll be passing on to Neil to talk about the performance that we've seen in these SIBs in their first 4 years, and then some of the benefits and disadvantages we've seen in the SIB model through our qualitative research. Next slide, please. And next one as well, please. Thank you. Very briefly on the evaluation then, as the evaluation is really focusing in on the SIB effect. So there are local evaluations that are focusing in on sort of the outcomes and the lessons learned through the interventions and the delivery. Where our evaluation comes in is sort of asking the question of around the SIB itself. So when we say the SIB effect, it's like, how is the design, delivery, performance of these interventions affected positively and negatively by the fact that they're funded through social impact bonds. So we're looking at the advantages and disadvantages of commissioning through a SIB, the challenges that people have faced in developing SIBs and how they could be overcome, and how outcomes funds like CBO and others could be used to sort of support the development and growth of SIBs in the future. The primary element of our research is tracking 9 of the 24 SIBs within CBO, visiting them at 3 points as they launch, halfway through delivery, and towards the end as well. Our aspiration is also to do some cost effectiveness analysis in a number of those, which we're just in the processes of exploring now. We also analyze the management information and the outcomes data collected on the impact bonds, and we survey the stakeholders across all of the SIBs as well. And then we produce a series of different reports linked to our findings at a project level. So each of those 9 in-depth reviews have their own reports. If you're interested in any of the examples that we give today, you can read much more into them, and also these program level reports where we cover sort of the analysis of all of CBO, which is what we're focusing on today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first part, as I said, we're going to be focusing in on what these different SIBs look like and their designs and why they seem to have been designed in particular ways. Next slide, please. Our aspiration here, up until this point, I think there had, and if you read other SIB evaluations, there had been a lot of comments that a SIB isn't really, I mean, it's barely a thing in a way, but it's certainly not one thing, that there are many different ways to design and develop SIBs. And we wanted to sort of take that claim one step further and think about, well, how are they designed differently? Why? And how does that compare to the sort of original concept of how they originally described when they were first launched over 10 years ago? In order to do that, we took sort of 2 different frameworks. We took, as you can see here in the bottom left corner, the GoLab SIB dimensions. So this was a report, I'm sure someone will put it in the chat, if not, I can do it later. But this was a report written by GoLab saying, what is a SIB? And arguably it's made up of these 4, how is it different to a grant and a PBR? And it's kind of made up of these 4 elements: payment linked to outcomes, the nature of the capital, so external investment. Generally, they have different levels of performance management, and they have a social mission embedded within them. And then the original concept is defined here on the right, and this was from a literature review done from Alec Fraser and others at London, who's on this call today, actually, I just saw, around what was the original policy ambition and description of what social impact bonds were about. And they were about this innovative partnership between private investors, commissioners, and providers. They were about improving social outcomes and generating cashable savings. They were about transferring financial risk, robust measurement of outcomes with attribution, and return to investors dependent on achievement of outcomes. So that's the context. That's what we were starting with when we did this analysis. If you could move on to the next slide. And so what we did is we took those 2 elements and we sort of unpicked the dimensions a bit, and we tried to create a framework that would allow us to objectively map and monitor the design of these different impact bonds. So we took the 4 dimensions within GoLab and we split one of them into 2, and that was the payment on outcomes. So we're thinking, well, actually, there's kind of 2 elements to that. There's the payment and the outcomes. So what are you paying on? Are you paying on outcomes, or are you paying on outputs, or is it a sort of blend with a block payment as well? And how are you measuring those outcomes? And do you have attribution? Do you sort of look at impact, or are you paying for sort of all outcomes and not necessarily focusing in on attribution? So they are the first 2, if you think of this as a clock, the top, and then the 2 o'clock on this hexagon. Then we had the other ones in terms of extent to which providers are shielded from financial risk by investors, the social missions, the extent to which VCSEs are involved in delivery, and the performance management, the level of additional performance management. And then we added a 6th one, because as I said, what we were trying to do is to look at this also in the context of what was their original conception and how do they compare to that original description that I provided in the last slide. And in addition to the GoLab dimensions, you've also had the original conception, this idea of investor save. So the outcomes release savings that then pay the outcome payments. You have this virtuous model of releasing savings to pay for the outcomes. So we built that into the model as well to try and track that. And the way we designed this is we had kind of different elements, different sort of milestones, if you like, on each of these different dimensions to create this hexagon. And the larger the hexagon, the more it aligns with an original textbook concept of what a SIB was. And the more it goes down the hexagons, the less it looks like an original SIB. So that was the framework that we did. And then the next few slides kind of show you what we found. So if you move on to the next slide. Thank you. So what this hexagon here on the right shows you is the average CBO SIB against those different hexagons. So as I said before, the more this looks like a hexagon, the more it's an original concept of a SIB. The more squashed it is, the more it moves away from that original concept. What this kind of shows you is that certain areas are holding true to what the original description and name of a SIB was. The vast majority of these had VCSEs delivering services. The reason why it's not quite full is because some of these, particularly EJAF, also involved public services as well. We did see in almost all of them additional extra performance management. In half of those, that was an external performance management. In the other half, that was done internally within the service provider, but more performance management than had been seen in similar delivery in that provider. And also, most of them did fully pay on outcomes. In 3 of them, it was a blend of outcome payments and also outputs as well, so engagement. So it wasn't full outcome payments, but most of them actually were. The areas where we saw more of a shift away from the original concept was the idea of financial risk transfer to external investors. We saw that full risk transfer in 5 of them, but in 4, so this is 9 we were looking at, in around half, there was actually a blend of financial risk sharing between the investors and the providers. So in some of those, the providers themselves were on a PBR contract, paid on engagements. In some of them, the providers had to repay some of the loan if there was an element of underperformance. So it was more risk sharing than risk transfer. The investor save and the idea they generated cashable savings was more of a hypothetical ambition than reality. They all definitely focused on the savings that the impact bonds were producing, but that saving either was an efficiency saving, didn't actually release savings, or the savings went to a different part of government, so they weren't being used to pay for the outcomes, or they were being paid for further down the line, not when the outcome payments were being made. So the notion of this virtuous circle, your savings paid for your outcomes, didn't really exist in reality in any of them. And the other area that was quite different to that original description was the degree of attribution that was built into the outcome payments. In 3 of the 9, there was an estimate to model attribution, but in the other 6, all outcomes were paid for. There wasn't necessarily a focus on, can you confidently attribute these to the intervention within the SIB? That is the high level, but I think it's also important, if we can move on to the next slide. This is all of the 9 SIBs that we had mapped onto all of those 6 different dimensions. What you can see, hopefully here, is every single one is completely different. So whilst that average kind of gives you an overall picture, what this tells you is the way that you can construct and design a SIB, you can do it in many, many different ways. And if you move on to the next slide, this is all 9 mapped next to each other. And again, you can sort of see a bit of a pattern. The top 3 have a lot of external additional performance management. Most of them have full risk transfer. The middle 3, the shape looks pretty similar, and the bottom 3 looks kind of similar. But again, I think the point to stress here is that they don't look like hexagons. So they've all, perhaps with the exception of PFP, all have moved quite a bit away from that original description of a SIB. And 2, they all look quite different, and they can be designed in many different ways. If you move on to the next slide. I won't talk about this too much, but the point to stress is we mapped in each of these 9 SIBs why. So why don't they look like a hexagon? What is the reason why something slightly different was done to what someone might expect to be done. And this is what the results showed. And the answer really is that there are many, many different, we've called them pressures. So we've sort of said that there's like, you've got the metamorphosis of this is the original SIB, and there are different pressures pushing on different elements of that design that kind of push it into a different direction. And they come from the commissioner priorities, they come from investor priorities, service provider priorities, also the local context, and actually perceptions and motivations that we did this. For example, we pushed some of the financial risks to providers on the belief that they need to have skin in the game in order for it to work. So some of this was the local context, and some of this was sort of perceptions and priorities as well. I will finish on the next two slides before handing over to Neil to talk about the latest, just to sort of have a discussion of, does this matter? And is it a good, like, why is this relevant? And is it a good or a bad thing? Your negative interpretation of this could be, well, these things were designed in a certain way and they had these certain promises, and actually none of them have actually met those objectives. A positive interpretation of this would be, well, that was an original concept, and what's happened is that original concept has been applied to reality, and reality is messy, and compromises and differences have to be made along the way. And actually what's happened is the principles of outcomes-based contracting have been applied in lots of different contexts. Personally, I would sit on that side, that I think this is an adaptation of the model to suit lots of different contexts and lots of different circumstances. Other opinions, and I'm sure we'll get into that in the panel, probably exist on that. But I think what's really important, and what hopefully has come across, is that you can design impact bonds in many different ways. And I think it's important that everybody knows what their impact bond looks like and why, and what compromises have been made, and that they're comfortable with those, and that there is a close alignment between the policy objective and the design of the impact bond. And I think that you didn't always see that in these impact bonds, which I do not think is a surprise, because these were the first ones. And I think in many ways people struggle to articulate what the policy objective was. But I think now we've got a better understanding of different ways that you can design impact bonds, and different objectives and different things that they could be achieved. And I think we can now have a more sophisticated conversation as to what are you trying to do, and therefore what should this impact bond look like. And if you move on to the next slide that I'm going to speak to before I pass on to Neil, some people might be thinking, what on earth does it mean, ensure your SIB design aligns to your policy objectives? So I've tried to add this slide, which is purely hypothetical, but it's sort of saying these are the 6 main policy objectives that were articulated in CBO as to why people are doing SIBs. So fund a preventative service, release cashable savings, shift risk to the private sector. You can see them here. And what I've tried to demonstrate is what would a SIB design look like that was aligned to each of those policy objectives. And so you've got different shapes based on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to produce a preventative model with cashable savings, you really need to have investor save logic built into your SIB. You need to be paying on outcomes, and you really need to have a good sense of attribution. So I think it'd be an interesting exercise if people are involved in impact bonds to try and think about, what is my objective, and does my SIB shape align to these ones here? And if not, why not? But that's everything on kind of the SIB shapes. I'm now going to pass over to Neil, who's going to talk about what we've seen in terms of their progress for the first 4 years.
Thanks very much, James. Before we start, I should introduce myself because we didn't do so earlier. I'm Neil Stanworth. I'm a director of ATQ. If James is claiming a decade of involvement in SIBs, I'm going to claim at least 12 years. Especially if I can include payment by results before SIBs existed, since we started advising in the life before ATQ existed in 2012 in terms of payment by results and the implications of some of the things government was piloting in that area. We've been involved in SIBs since 2011, and we've been involved in the evaluation of SIBs since 2013, when we collaborated with James and Nicoris on this evaluation. As James said, I'm going to say a little bit about what we found out to date about CBO performance based on data up to 2018, and also about some of the benefits and disadvantages of SIBs that we've so far identified from the quality of research. Those two things link closely together, I think, as I'll explain a bit more. So if we could have the next slide, please. So at a very high level, there's more data in the report as ever, but so far, based on the data we had at 2018, the performance of the CBO SIBs has been lower than was predicted and expected. The primary reason for that, we think, is lower referrals than predicted and planned, which in turn feeds through to outcomes. So although, as you can see on that slide, both engagements and outcomes are below expectations, we think the major issue is that referrals have not been as high as expectations. I'm simplifying here, and I would urge you to read the full report, but that is what we think is the main driver. And a key high-level issue for us is that because the projects have been under-delivering, or is it because the forecasts of how well they would do were perhaps a bit optimistic? We've come out quite strongly in thinking it's the latter rather than the former. Indeed, we think there's some empirical evidence so far that these SIBs are performing quite well and perhaps performing better than other projects. So if we can move on, I think, to the next bit, and we'll talk about the benefits and disadvantages of the model, which illustrates where we think the performance has done well and not so well in some areas. So next slide, please. So the analysis that's in the update report is based on the projects we had in progress at the time. So at that point, we published second midpoint reviews that looked at performance to date on 3 projects, Waste to Wellness, MHEP and West London Zone. And we had 2 unpublished reviews where we completed most of the fieldwork but hadn't yet published the reviews. It's important to emphasize that is the basis of the analysis. We've since published more second reviews. So if we were doing this again, and we will be doing it again at the end, we'll have more data on which to go. And we're now well on with some of the third reviews, which will be more summative and look back at performance as a whole. We'll also look at other issues such as the sustainment of some of these projects. But that's what we looked at in this. And in the report, there's a detailed analysis of the issues that arose from the process evaluation. And then there's an overall summary, a somewhat cruder but simpler to look at analysis in red, amber, green form. So I'm going to run you through both of those, and then we can talk in more detail in the questions afterwards. So next slide, please. So we look at the main benefits. As James has already talked about in terms of the SIB dimensions, one of the ones that was expected and we've found to be proved is that they do have more and better performance management. We put better in inverted commas because it's not as simple as saying it's just better. It's that there is specific funding of an enhanced level of performance management, whether that's delivered by the provider or more usually by a third party working with the provider. And it also comes from the incentive to greater and more regular scrutiny of performance that comes from the focus on outcomes that is built into all these contracts because they're outcomes based and because payment is linked to outcomes. We've also found that there is improved data and systems. Many of these projects have their own bespoke systems that were built for them. Even if that's not the case, they've used data and systems innovatively to make sure that they've got up-to-date reporting. And consistently, stakeholders told us that they had better data, there was more deep diving of data, there was more challenge of data than they were used to in conventional projects. There are also 2 ways in which we found that the projects were very adaptable and flexible. The first, which is familiar to many, I think, is the fact that they're outcomes based means that they adapt delivery to user needs. Although some of them deliver quite high fidelity interventions, there is much more flexibility than is normal to adapt delivery in each and every case. And there's also flexibility that comes from the funding. So in many of these, the funding is given via an investor, which we found means that providers effectively can do what it takes to deliver the outcomes for individuals in a way that some of them thought they couldn't in other contracts. There's also a flexibility, which is a slightly more controversial aspect, which is to renegotiate and change the contract terms as you go along. This can be built into any contract. we accept that. But we have found that it happens quite a lot. And it happens because there tends to be all parties sitting around the table when things are going well but could go better, or are not going as well as expected and need to be improved, and saying, do we need to change the way the contract is actually constructed? So those are quite important. The reason that's controversial is that some people feel that more projects should stick to what they said they were going to do, and it does have some adverse consequences, which I'll come on to in a minute. The last two things is providers did tell us they felt that some of these projects, in some cases, had improved their focus on outcomes and to some extent changed their culture. We're aware of providers who've now become saying we'd like outcomes built into all our projects, please, even when it wasn't a requirement. And the last, and perhaps most controversial, is that stakeholders told us that they thought that these projects had achieved greater social impact. So empirically and qualitatively, we're being told that they've improved performance. This is something that many on this call will know is very hard to prove quantitatively, and there's still quite a lot of consideration being given to how we might do that. Just move on to the next slide. The version of this that appears in the report has headings and content on it, but this in snapshot form tells you how some of these projects have performed. In very simplistic terms, and it is simplistic, green is better than amber, is better than red. So it's clear that some projects have performed better than others. But as I say, performance varies across various aspects, and there are good reasons why some of them have not shown the benefits that others have. So we can move on to some of the disadvantages, the disbenefits, if you like. The first and second, we think, link closely together. So in many of these projects, we've seen underperformance, which tends to create tension. So although many of these projects involve high collaboration and a good degree of partnership, when things go wrong, there is a degree of tension, and there's a special tension between investors and providers about why performance is going wrong and what might be done about it if there is underperformance. But a consistent theme we found is that underperformance is often because those who designed the project had an optimistic view of what could be delivered. And that applies both to providers when they're leading and to other parties when they're involved in making the project business case work. And it's fairly consistent across most of the projects. So inevitably you get a degree of chicken and egg here. Because the projects have got some optimism bias built into them, people are inevitably chasing their tails. And it's sometimes quite difficult to disentangle which came first and what would have been the right approach. We certainly thought that if people weren't so optimistic, then there wouldn't have been so much underperformance. Another thing is that the changes I talked about earlier, particularly to contracts, can have adverse implications. So James talked about two dimensions of SIBs that are particularly important to people. One is that providers are protected from risk by investors. And what we found is sometimes that can change during a project. So providers can be asked to take risks when they didn't expect to be taking risks. We've also found some providers who should have known all along that there was a degree of risk involved in the project, but had either not realized that or had underestimated what its implications might have been for them. So although there was risk sharing from the start, they hadn't quite realized what its implications might be. And the other important one is where contract terms have changed to ask commissioners to pay more up front, either in a block payment or an engagement payment or some sort of payment that is linked more to output and activity than to true outcome, when the original promise sold to them was that they wouldn't have to pay except for outcomes. Most commissioners seem to have been pretty happy with those changes, but it is fair to say that it's a move away from what their expectation was and the way they were told that risk would be entirely transferred to a third party. And the last major disadvantage we found was a real challenge of commissioner engagement. We found this in other research that we've done with the Chorus as well, that there's significant management churn across many of the organizations, which means that it's a constant challenge to keep re-engaging those commissioners in the project and keep them committed to it. And I know that many on this call would say that applies to all projects and all complex projects, and they're absolutely right. But a thing we found is that because of the complexity of SIVs and social outcomes contracts, then it's an additional challenge for new commissioners and new people engaged in projects to get up to speed. And there's also an extent to which new people may not be as committed to the whole model. They may not be very comfortable with it. So whole projects can change in their emphasis or even stop altogether because there's a change in commissioner engagement. So next slide, please. That just shows where we saw those things on the different projects again. And as it shows, some projects saw their disadvantages more than others. Again, colour's the same. So green means the disadvantages weren't so apparent. Red means they were more apparent. So lastly, move on, just to summarise, I think what both James has said and what I've said. SIVs come in many different shapes and sizes, and it's important that design aligns to the policy objective. And we think it's important that assumptions are robustly tested during the design stage. If those assumptions aren't right, then there's a high risk that the project will start to appear at least to be underperforming, which will in turn make it less likely to succeed and start causing the parties to disagree with each other and lead to other changes to projects. Having said all that, we got a fairly strong view that stakeholders in the projects we reviewed were of the view that these projects were succeeding and were achieving more outcomes and greater social impact than would have been the case if they had not had built into them either the outcomes-based mechanism in the payment by results or the social investment that supported their delivery, or both. I'm going to stop there and leave as much time as we can for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, James. And no, Jess, I think we can stop sharing the slides for a few minutes. Thank you so much, both of you. Wow, what a rich set of insights. My brain is buzzing and I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat at the same time. Huge thanks to all of you who've answered my questions, each other's questions, and James, I've noticed you've already and Phil picked up some of the questions in the chat. So we've got about 10 minutes before we need to move on into the panel discussion where we'll hear more from Chris, and it's really exciting to actually be able to hear from one of the projects themselves, and then Elle will help put the discussion into a wider context. So just from the comments I've picked up from the chat, so there was a question early on from Alec Fraser around sustaining impacts after SIBs, and I'm just curious, James and Neil, whether that's something that whether it's in scope of the evaluation, perhaps at a later stage.
Yeah, thank you, Alec. I didn't know whether you meant sustaining impact in terms of the beneficiary level outcomes, or whether whether you meant the project sustainment itself. I think if you're talking about the first question, that's not really built into the evaluation because we're really focusing on the kind of SIB model challenges and benefits. We're not necessarily doing an additional service user long-term outcomes. It's possible some of the local evaluations are doing that, and if they do, they kind of get fed to us and we'll be able to answer that. So I can't really answer that question. But if you meant the second question, I don't know if you did, but I'll answer that anyway. What I think is really interesting, and I don't know if this is sort of emerging findings, I don't know if it really came out from Neil's presentation, but one of the extra benefits I think we see in some of these SIBs is that the focus on the outcomes and the outcome measurement is often stronger than the previous contracts that have gone before it. And so actually what you end up with at the end of the contract is a pretty solid evidence base of that contract, more so I think than people think than they would have done otherwise. And I think that actually is helping with some of the sustainment. And I'm sure Chris will come in on this, but I think Waste to Wellness is one of those examples where the SIB data generated for the data has actually presented a pretty strong case for the service itself. And I think we've seen that in some. So I think there is an argument that the SIB model and the outcome focus can actually have a positive contribution to the impact of the service. But I don't actually think that's what you're answering, but I thought I'd say it anyway.
Yeah, it wasn't in my presentation because we're focusing solely on the second reviews where we haven't really looked at sustainment. Apart from the point James has made, which is 100% correct. I think, well, in the third reviews, which are in draft in various stages, we certainly are looking at sustainment in quite a variety of ways. I.e., does it directly lead to more projects that are very similar in the same area? Does it lead to similar projects elsewhere? Is there a take forward of the intervention on a wider scale? And Alec, you know a bit about that from your own work in Elton John AIDS Foundation, which you know, that's in the public domain, has clearly informed a rollout of testing for HIV more widely across the NHS. It's quite tricky in some, though, we were already finding, to prove cause and effect. People tend to claim good effects and deny bad effects. Yes. But overall, the story is pretty positive about, I think, wider effects, but not always in terms of there's definitely another successor project that's almost identical.
Super, thank you. Alec, has that answered your question? Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, that's all, thank you.
Super, thank you. And I saw a new question in the chat from John, who's asking if we could describe in more detail the research designs in dimension 2, the degree of counterfactual rigor. So James, would you be happy to take that question? And can I add to that while we're on the hexagon itself, because you've mentioned squashing the hexagon and also pulling it. Is there a risk or a scenario where we've pulled it so far or stretches so far that actually perhaps it's no longer helpful or it doesn't make sense to call it an impact one? Are there any lines? And like flexibility is great. I think a lot of stakeholders, I think this comes across in your research as well, find that flexibility that comes with an outcome focused partnership welcome. But again, is there a risk? And I think there were some discussions in the chats around this, that you're too flexible and moving too far from the sort of initial intentions of a particular program.
Great question. The number one, I was actually putting in the chat, but I'm happy to talk about it. What we were focusing on, John, was the degree to which, so the original conception and sort of description of an impact bond is that you're paying by results, you're paying what works based on rigorous measurement. And so if you think of like the Peterborough Prison, which is the first impact bond, you've there got a counterfactual and they're paying on impact. So 10%, I think, reduced recidivism compared to a comparison group. So what we were trying to map in that was, to what degree is the outcome payment, to what degree is it paying for impact? So is it ensuring that it's only paying for outcomes where you've got a reasonable confidence those outcomes can be attributed to this intervention, versus paying for any outcomes that happen to the cohort under receipt of the service, which could be because of the service, or it could be because of an entirely different reason. And what we saw was in the limited number, and waste to wellness is one of them, there was an impact evaluation built into it. So the payment model for 70% of the payments in waste to wellness is reduced hospital spend relative to another part of Newcastle. So there's a reasonable attribution in there. But I think we found in most of the impact bonds, they were generally pre-post measurement tools. So kind of sort of baseline taken, and then payments based on progress following that baseline, which doesn't really take account of dead weight and attribution and other elements as well. And most of them fit into that category. So that hopefully answers that question. Your question, Andrea, do you get to a point where you stretch it so much? I think you're saying, is it either an impact bond or does it move away from the whole concept of outcomes-based contracting at all? I think that's what you were saying. That's why I was like, does it matter? On one level, I don't think it does, provided that everybody knows what it is. And this is why I'm saying that I think sometimes you can get to conversations where people think they're involved in a SIB where they're paying for what works and there's full transfer to the investor. And actually, when you look under the bonnet, that doesn't exist. And so there's a bit of a mismatch between what people think they've got and what they've actually got. And I think sometimes the model is so complicated that some people don't actually know that. They can't even lift the bonnet, or they look at the bonnet and probably look at a car engine in the same way that I do, don't have a clue what's going on. So I think that's a problem, that there's a misalignment between people what think it is and what it actually is. Does it actually matter? Does it undermine the principles? I don't really think it does. And we can get into EGAF. EGAF goes so far beyond what an impact bond is, in this is a foundation paying for the outcome payments. It's not local government, and the payments are actually going from a foundation to the public sector. It's pretty much full PBR. So it goes so far beyond what a SIB is, but I mean, Neil knows more about it than I do. He might contradict me, but the logic of it and the kind of principles of it are still sort of doing what they intended to do. So, and actually some people were saying calling it a SIB, I think we've talked about this before, there's kind of like a magic dust. Yeah. It's kind of like a brand that people really like, and it excites people that they're doing a SIB. So does it matter that EGAF is a SIB, but it's not really a SIB? I don't think it really does matter. But yeah, go on, Neil.
Well, I was going to 100% agree. I think it's interesting that in some way, you know, in our first review of the Elton John AIDS Foundation EGAF one, we said, you could have done this without a SIB. You could have done it differently. But we've had a lot of pushback from stakeholders saying, we wanted this. It was a great SIB. Everyone loved it being a SIB. It was actually galvanic in its impact. So, but the more important point that James has said, I think, is that it doesn't matter as long as people know what it is. And I think that innovative slide that James put up where he said what they might look like if you're trying to achieve specific objectives is quite interesting, because it's the misalignment between that and what people think they are that is what matters. So to take the counterfactual example that James picked up earlier, one of my bugbears is people say we're rigorously testing a new and innovative intervention, but they don't have a strong counterfactual. Now, if you're only trying to achieve outcomes by hook or by crook and get as many outcomes as you can, help as many people as you can keep adapting and changing the project and it won't matter. But if you're trying to test it rigorously, then the counterfactual is very important. And minimal change in adaptation is also, I think, very important. But it's people need to know what they're trying to do with these things. That's what matters.
Okay, clarity of objectives and alignment between dimensions and those objectives. I did notice Janet, I think along the lines of what we were just discussing, she's asking what is the purpose of SIB as a model if we're not transferring risk? And I think you've already addressed that. I don't know whether anyone else wants to jump in on this point. Nigel, a fellow GoLabber, I noticed that you've been very active in the chat. Is there anything else that you want to add kind of out in the plenary? Maybe to Janet's question.
No, I mean, I think I agree very much, with James and Neil on this. I think this is a question, I think SIBs are not always doing what they said they would do, but they are doing other good stuff. And I think where our research is going on this, and I think this is backed up by a lot of what's in that CBO evaluation, is that what these social impact bonds do seem to be doing is leading to a different quality of relationship between commissioners or government, government outcomes payers, whatever you want to call them, and provider organizations, an improved quality of relationship, and one where risk is shared and outcomes are negotiated between the provider and the commissioner, but also with service users. And they seem to be taking that relationship into a less transactional space. So rather than commissioners thinking that they know exactly what is needed to solve a particular social issue and they just need to find the provider that can only do what they've specified, they're recognizing that actually they need something that's far more responsive to what's actually going on the ground. And the SIB mechanism, for all of its peculiarities and complexities, does seem to be unlocking a lot of that sort of practice. And I think that's the happy accident of social impact bonds in the UK. To what degree that's replicated with social impact bonds in other countries is another interesting question, which is beyond probably the scope of the discussion today. But, you know, what do these hexagon diagrams look like on SIBs in America or on development impact bonds? You know, and are they actually, even though they share a name, designed in quite different ways to do quite different things? I think, you know, that's another interesting dimension to potentially explore.
Just to pick up, sorry, just to pick up that point about risk. The important thing on the risk transfer, it only matters if it's not what people thought it was going to be. Yeah, and the risk transfer, the risk sharing with providers, it's important to stress. When James was saying it, I was slightly afraid it would come across as saying, you know, this is a bad idea. Most of the time it happens because providers positively want to share the risk or want to take all the risk on a payment by results model effectively. They don't want, because they believe in what they're trying to achieve and they're passionate about what they're trying to achieve and they think it will succeed, and they don't want to give away all that upside to an investor effectively. So it's not a case, it only matters if they thought they so I've seen some projects where you see different models, some where the provider is taking all the risk and he's very happy with that, some where the provider isn't taking any of the risk and he's very happy with that. But if they reverse those roles, they'd both be unhappy.
Great, thanks. No, Janet, was there anything you wanted to add, perhaps in response to what Nigel and Neil just said? Feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I just put that in the chat. They might want to take the risk to begin with when they think they're going to get loads of profit from it, but then when that fails, they then say, oh no, we can't afford that level of risk, we either cut all of the services or you need to give us more money, and we end up renegotiating and transferring the risk. So I just wonder, are there not alternatives such as alliance contracting where we still focus on those relationships and those outcomes, and I absolutely support that, but is there not another way of doing it without kind of pretending, if you like, that we're transferring this risk? Or risk it, or actually taking on more operational risk than we need to, because we, you know, if those outcomes aren't being met, we then don't get any service at all. And maybe there are some projects where that's okay if you don't get the service, but actually there are others where we can't afford to not have any services, even if they're not quite getting the outcomes we'd have hoped.
Totally.
Thank you, Janet. Right, I think it's now time to introduce our two remaining guest panelists who haven't had a chance to say anything yet. So, Chris, can I come to you next? So you've chaired the Waste to Wellness Impact Bonds for I think about 7 years until earlier this summer. It would be great to hear what your experience has been, and maybe if you could give us an overview of the project to begin with, and perhaps how some of the dimensions that James explained relate to waste to wellness. Do they resonate with your experience?
Thanks, Andrea, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted that Waste to Wellness has all ambers and greens in its RAG ratings and no reds, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been a bumpy ride on occasions. Essentially, we started work on this in around 2011 and went live in 2015. And the focus was always on long-term conditions. Long-term conditions, 70% of the costs of the NHS, increasing numbers of people in developed nations with long-term conditions, hospital costs, an increasing concern, basically. And so we spent a lot of time in the first 3 years sort of looking at the data, looking at what the metrics would be that we would use, and developing a logic model. And essentially, briefly, the logic model was, unless you improve people's quality of life, you're unlikely to change their behavior around use of hospitals. So the metrics was essentially the triangle long-term conditions star. We went for that model because some of the voluntary sector organisations we've been working with in the Northeast were already using the Wellbeing Star. it has certain advantages in terms of it also functions as a quality assurance tool to make sure that people cover all the bases. And you've got an automatic metric in terms of you've got 8 points of the star which cover the social determinants of health. And each point on that star is numbered 1 to 5. So you've got a total of 40 points. And we ended up with an agreement that 30% of the repayments would come from improvements on the wellbeing star above 1.5 points 6 months after the first star was measured. So that was point one. We then sort of looked at well, where's the counterfactual? And essentially the counterfactual was specific long-term conditions for which GPs had registers and for which North of England Commissioning Support Organisation could actually look at hospital costs for those individuals and could also generate a counterfactual in terms of a population we were operating in West Newcastle and a similar population in North and East Newcastle with sort of ensuring that they had the same sort of socio-demographic characteristics in terms of inequalities, basically. So and on that basis and the logic model, we negotiated a 7-year contract with the CCG, of which the SIB was part, because our argument essentially was you're unlikely to make changes in behaviour and they're unlikely to have an impact on secondary care costs until you're well into the project. So we set ourselves up as a charitable foundation with the sole purpose of running the SIB. Were not direct providers. We then went out and commissioned and procured for VCSE organisations initially and let 2-year contracts with a startup payment as part of those 2-year contracts so that they could get themselves sorted, they could recruit link workers, they could build up referral rates. And at the end of year 2, it was clear that those 4 providers, there was a variation in referral rates. That was also perhaps alongside our optimism bias, if you like, that we set fairly ambitious referral targets. And we had hoped to get referrals, self-referrals, and we had also hoped to get referrals from secondary care hospital outpatient clinics. None of those materialized, and the referrals almost universally came from general practices. And there was also sort of significant variation in referral from different practices. So a lot of work had to go on. And at the end of year 2, when the first contracts ended, we reset the contracts around incentive. We took out the base payment and essentially reallocated that to incentivize referrals. And at that point, essentially, two of our providers dropped out because they didn't think they'd meet the referral targets. So we then sort of reallocated. The other problem we had at that stage was a cash flow problem in terms of we were looking in advance at sort of potential savings from secondary care costs, which were going to be 70% of the referrals, and they were substantially less than we had anticipated in our financial model. And at that stage, we sort of talked about renegotiation. We had discussions with the big lottery who agreed to increase the outcome payment for the wellbeing star, but not above sort of the 50%, which was their limit, to help with cash flow. We had some discussions with the CCG. The CCG the commissioners wanted to stick with the target essentially, and long story short, but detailed investigation, we eventually discovered that actually an error had been made in the counterfactual in terms of comparison between the control and the intervention group. That somebody had forgotten to include A&E figures in the control group, but had included them in the intervention group. So a slight warning there in terms of if you're dependent on data from others, you have to look at it very carefully. And sort of that made a significant difference to our cash flow, and subsequently we've kind of moved forward, and as we predicted, over time the gap between the intervention and the control group has increased, and is now running at about 10.4% in terms of an improvement. When we started, we looked at data for 2014, and the control and the intervention group. The intervention group was slightly more expensive than the control group. Subsequently, that diverged, and the intervention group is now 10.4% cheaper in terms of hospital costs than the control group. And the biggest difference has been to unscheduled admissions. So clearly, and the CCG finance director agrees with all of that and has taken that on board. And post SIB, we've now got a block contract where we've done away with the secondary care data, because we've made the assumption that improvements on the wellbeing star will result in improvements in secondary care costs. So we now have a sort of a continuing block contract, and we've extended to moving out into the whole of Newcastle rather than just West Newcastle. So there is incremental increase in size. And I'm happy to say we have a reasonably healthy bank balance, and some credibility with the NHS in terms of we now have 3 subsequent projects in terms of a project across the North East and North Cumbria for link workers for maternal mental health services, with 4 different voluntary sector providers, Middlesbrough, Sunderland, South East Northumberland, and Whitehaven, Workington in Cumbria. We've also got a project about waiting well and link workers with people predominantly waiting for hip and knee replacements on high levels of opioid medication, working with them so that they're fitter when they go into hospital, so that they don't get stuck in hospital and can be discharged, and the turnover has increased. And then a final one with the Great North Children's Hospital on children with complex neurodisability. So it essentially, it has exceeded my expectations in terms of where we eventually got to, and where the organisation is now. I've now stopped being chair and handed over to others, basically.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Chris. So I was going to ask you about how Waste to Wellness is thinking about the sustainability of its work beyond this particular impact one. I think you've already touched upon that. And so would you say that then there are particular elements like SIP principles that you are taking into these new projects that you've just mentioned?
I think there are some principles in terms of I'm quite wedded to the special purpose vehicle model in terms of if we're going to make better use of the energy and enthusiasm of the voluntary and community sector, having and to an extent we've kind of almost set ourselves up as an innovation hub for the North East and North Cumbria, where we work with voluntary sector organisations across the patch to pilot and develop new ways of working, and this kind of fits with where the NHS is at, because they don't necessarily want multiple contracts with multiple numbers of relatively small voluntary sector organisations. They prefer to have a single contract with a single organisation who then, if you like, acts as the intermediary. So that's sort of one issue, I think, in terms of the longer term sustainability.
That's really, really interesting. And I think we're seeing that with other impact bonds. I would like to come on to you in just a minute, but before that, Chris, there was another question in the chat from Janice. She's asking specifically who was assessing the outcome star. Were they independent of who would benefit if there was an improvement?
The outcome star is interesting. It is essentially in terms of our providers, and we didn't want to pay the providers on improvements on the wellbeing star because we were concerned about gaming. So the providers are simply paid on the basis of referrals, ways to wellness, and Triangle provides training, and we look at the variation between link workers, and as I say, using it as a quality assurance tool to make sure you cover all of the bases are important parts of that. I don't know if does that answer the question basically?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. We've been talking a lot about the experience with UK SIVs. That's obviously the focus of the evaluation report, and it's just been like really great to have the kind of on the ground example from Chris. But can you help us set this into a wider context? How does this resonate with the international experience? I know you've recently co-authored a paper that compares specifically US to UK. James has mentioned earlier, you know, what if we were to apply this hexagon to, or I think it was Nigel actually, to SIBs in France or other countries. So do you have a sense as to whether this framework would work elsewhere, or is actually there's even more variation if we look outside UK?
Thank you. Thanks for such a great presentation and for all of these great questions. So I think we seem to all be in agreement that beneath this shared label of impact bonds, we see enormous variation. And certainly globally, all of these projects share a commitment to pursue measurable outcomes. But beyond that, they're all designed in very different ways with very different scale, working in different partnership structures, with different outcome measures, different participant groups, different investor models, you know, and all of the rest of it. So I think it's really helpful to move the conversation on to thinking about impact bonds more as a family of different approaches rather than a single model or single principle. I'm a big advocate for the Indigo impact bonds data set, and I think that can be really helpful for beginning to describe some of this variation. But actually, I think James and Neil's work really pushes, you know, much further than what we've currently got available for looking at this globally at the moment in Indigo. So you're really encouraging us, I think, to peel back and look at the more subtle variation that we see across these different things that call themselves impact bonds or social outcomes contracts. And I don't think you're suggesting that we should use the hexagon everywhere. And I think that there might be some corners or dimensions that are relevant for analysis beyond the UK. There might be some angles that aren't. And we might also need to think about octagons or other multi-sided shapes, because I think there might be other dimensions that we want to start bringing in as well. One of the things that I was struck by at the Social Outcomes Conference was something that Abba Thorat-Shah from the British Asian Trust said in our conversation around the stretchiness of impact bonds. And particularly when we're thinking about impact bonds in low-income contexts, is that who is performing the role of the outcomes payer might not be government. And so we need to think about whether it's always appropriate to be layering on a kind of public service reform narrative when we're looking at these things, but actually there might be other dimensions that we need to consider in lower income contexts. We also know that this fixation on cashable savings is quite particular to austerity and to austerity in England. You know, we don't always hear demands for SIBs to wash their face from other country contexts. And I saw that Mathilde Pellizzari was on the line, and I know that some of Mathilde's work has looked at the variation across different country contexts around the justifications for the model. And so I think that's one dimension that may be less relevant as we look at the adoption of the model at different points in time and at different country contexts. But I do think that this sense of sort of stretchiness and exploring the variation across different dimensions is incredibly helpful for understanding and exploring the different purposes of impact bonds. And we're beginning to move into a conversation, I think, about sort of different shapes for different contexts and different goals, which I think is a really, energizing way to think about the flexibility of the model and how we might go about applying it more broadly. And so thanks, Andrea, for teeing me up to talk a little bit about this paper that I worked on with my colleagues, Christy Economy and Mara Iroldi. And we ask this question, kind of, have we stretched social impact bonds too far? And we look at the design of 114 social impact bonds in the United States and in the UK. But we only focus really on two dimensions of the original intention: paying for impact and transferring risk. And actually, a lot of our conclusions really align with Neil and James. We conclude that in the UK, payable outcomes are generally not subject to rigorous evaluation methods. But in the US, it's far more common to link experimental or quasi-experimental impact evaluation to the payment mechanism. So we can really begin to sense a difference in the design and the stretch of these projects. And we also find it interesting to unpack whether the upfront capital is independent and at risk. And again, there seems to be variation in the UK and the US environments here. Most of the UK, or perhaps I should say English SIBs, involve social investors who, at least to some degree, are sharing risk with service providers. But in the US, there seems to be far less sharing of risk with service providers. They seem to be far more insulated, but we have philanthropic capital that's regularly serving as a junior lender or a guarantor. So we have different patterns of risk sharing across these different contexts. And I think that's important when we think about what are the goals and what is the intent of these different projects. So we might need to think more carefully about that risk sharing piece. And I also just wanted to pick up on some of the questions that are coming through in the chat as well, because I think we're left with a little bit of an awkward question here, because we don't yet have very much data on outcomes. Given that these are all outcomes-based projects, well, what does this hexagon mean? Does it mean anything when we look at the different performance of these projects? And are we yet in a position to unpack and understand, well, how does this play out in the different successes and different achievement of outcomes in these different projects? And I think that's hopefully where we're going to start moving to next, is more research questions about which dimensions and which designs might unlock more conducive kind of cross-sector partnerships, and ultimately might that have implications for the function and the success of these projects. But I think this is such a great conversation, and I really feel like this stretchiness and thinking about what that might mean is really a great contribution. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are getting very close to the end of the session. We've got about 10 minutes left. Thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far, and thank you to our participants for the excellent questions. Chris, I see you have your hand out, so I'll come to you in a second. Just before we say goodbye, I would like to come back to each of our panelists and ask them for kind of one key takeaway that they want practitioners in the virtual room to take away from this session, right? Beyond the more abstract dimensions and so on, kind of what's the one key thing that you want practitioners or policymakers to take away from our discussion? I do have another question that I'd like to ask, but I will give others the chance to ask their questions first. So Chris, I'll come to you next. And in the meanwhile, if anyone else on the Zoom room has any questions or anything else they want to add, please put your virtual hand up or drop your question in the chat. But for now, over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Andrea. Couple of things. One, I think one of the things I've picked up and learnt from all of this is impact on populations is as important as impact on individuals, and some issues about doing this at scale. I mean, it essentially, we were looking at a population of 14,000 people with our specific long-term conditions. Type 2 diabetes was the most common long-term condition. It was about sort of over 40% of our referrals. And some more detailed research by Newcastle University, funded through the National Institute of Health Research, demonstrated that we had a statistically significant impact on HbA1c, which is the marker for type 2 diabetes and improvements in type 2 diabetes. It wasn't something that we were trying to do. If you're looking at the medical model, everybody's changing the drugs or encouraging people to eat a better diet and take more exercise. Our interventions were bespoke, but clearly in terms of the population, we've shifted the bell curve to the left. And there were also indications that measurements of blood pressure were also shifting to the left. So that impact on population, particularly our more disadvantaged populations, is, I think, incredibly important. And you only get that if you're operating at a population level rather than an individual level. So that's kind of one takeaway. I think my other one is that metrics are important, and actually getting the metrics right and looking at impact is incredibly important, and with tightening budgets will become increasingly important.
Fantastic, Chris. You're ahead of me. You've already shared your takeaway. I do have a final question. Elle, you've mentioned performance. Actually, Phil, I know you had a slide ready to share with us on how the projects are doing now. I know that the evaluation report, it's a sort of midpoint result. So I don't know if you want to give us a flavor of that. Sorry, is it? Yes, that's it.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through it in detail, obviously, because of time, but generally speaking, the programme has done pretty well against its original objectives. It hasn't been 100%, and all our outcomes were against the maximum possible achievement, a high scenario. And we're delighted that most of the projects presently are above their base case contract. And those several of the projects which aren't quite there are early stage projects. We're delighted to have got 24 projects on board. We're delighted with the volumes of VCSEs. Slightly disappointed at the lack of engagement by some commissioners. And there are lots of questions coming from the work we've done. Every time we've gone down another rabbit hole and found some more information that needs to be looked at, which we just haven't had the opportunity to do. For instance, we'd like to see, how did the providers actually benefit? What surplus did they take away? And we haven't been able to do that. So we learned a lot, but I think there's a lot more learning which will come out of Life Chances Fund and other programs in the future. Our general takeaway would be, if SIBs are useful, then use them, but adapt them. We've been really flexible as a funder to meet people's requirements within certain limited restrictions, as Chris referenced, not being able to be a majority funder. But generally speaking, we've been able to meet the needs of projects. So if you're going into somewhere with a funder behind you, test the funder and push that funder to maximize the support you can get from those individuals. There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phil. Had two top takeaways so far from Phil and Chris. Let's go to Neil, James, and then Elle for final top tips of takeaway before we say goodbye.
I'll probably steal James's here, but I would say that make sure you know why you're doing this. The thing I find when we talk to a lot of stakeholders, say we're doing this, and they come up with 12 reasons why they're doing a SIB or a social outcomes contract. And some of those are internally contradictory. I've highlighted one earlier. You can't test an intervention and keep adapting it. One of the published reports shows at least 7 major changes made to one of the projects midway through, one which claimed at the outset to be testing an innovative intervention. But in terms of scientific method, that's just not possible. You can't make that many changes and still work out cause and effect. So work out what you're trying to do them for and stick to it. And if it's catchable savings, then you've got to have a solid case on where the catchable savings are going to come from. If it's testing, you've got to have a solid counterfactual. Focus on those things and don't try and do everything with one of these projects.
Fantastic, thanks, Neil. James.
Yeah, Neil did steal mine. He knew he was going to.
It's like,
I'm going to have to rapidly think of another one.
like pointless. I answered first. I got the best answer.
I'm going to pick up on the other conversation we're having of transfer of risk, and that actually what seems to happen is there's a belief that people are taking on risk, either the investor or the provider, and actually when they face that risk, really they can't take it on. So I think having realistic conversations up front about who actually can take on this risk, and doing that at the beginning rather than someone said pretending and then changing it later. So I think that'd be my main point.
Super, thank you. Oh, no pressure, but the last one to add your top takeaway or top tip.
Thank you. Well, I would take 2. I would like to echo Phil. These things are meant to be useful. So I think this is an encouragement to kind of play and stretch, because this is no one thing and it needs to be adapted to the context and the operating environment. But I'd also like to make a little bit of a call to projects, so people who are working on live projects, to maybe push back and challenge some of the research frameworks or the data that we have that describes and articulates projects that you are working on and with. Does this feel like an authentic description of the project that you're delivering? Does it capture the ways in which it is different to more conventional ways of funding or holding services to account? Is there something else that we're just not getting? I think this is a great format, the engaging with evidence sessions, for tussling over describing and understanding these things. And of course, we also have the Indigo peer learning group, where we're trying to build a lively and authentic description of these projects. We're often running to keep up with practice, so please keep humouring us as we try to describe these things in a way that is meaningful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I guess as the chair, I'll use that prerogative to add my own takeaway from this session. And I think, not to repeat all the excellent points that were made so far, one thing that strikes me is actually how far we've progressed the narrative around what social impact bonds are for. And I remember in the early day of the Go Lab, one of the key questions that we kept getting was, are SIBs better than more conventional way to pay for public services? And indeed, I think James and Neil, you conclude in your report that it remains challenging to prove objectively that a SIB works better than a conventional contract. But I think from what we've been hearing today, there are lots of other perhaps more helpful or fruitful questions that we can be asking around how and when different principles within this mechanism might be helpful. But I think as Elle was saying, we can only make progress on this in a meaningful way if we also look at performance data and if we're able to access that in a kind of open manner. So very much looking forward to further updates from the CBO fund and looking forward to the next evaluation report. I've got 1 minute left, which gives me just about enough time to say an absolutely huge thank you to everyone who joined the session today. Thank you for being such a fantastic audience. Actually, more than audience, very active participants, and also an absolutely huge thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. I've certainly learned a lot from this session, and I hope everyone else has too. A huge thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea, for hosting. Thanks, everyone.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.